let me know when you start recording.
All right, we're started.
All right, so our first question is over the first part of chapter 7 of Eloquent Rage, and it is, why did Cooper state that respectability politics had ended the day Michelle Obama showed up to her last official engagement? What I got out of this chapter is that essentially after, performing the role of a respectable woman of color throughout her tenure in the White House, making sure that she didn't do anything that people could, use as like a political jab against her husband's career and their family in general. She kind of just threw that all out the window at Trump's inauguration, because essentially it says on page 150, sums it up pretty well. The subtlety in her refusal of pomp and circumstance belied a deep disdain for the way in which the American people had rejected her work, and that of President Obama, by essentially installing his nemesis. I mean, Trump was the leader of the whole birther movement, trying to say that he couldn't be president because he wasn't born here, and she was pissed. She was basically like, screw it all. You guys didn't respect anything that we did, so I'm done trying to fit the role of the respectable first lady. And she did that, not by making a big deal, but just by showing up in a very unceremonious get up, I guess. Like, she didn't, like, before she would put a lot of emphasis into like doing her hair up and showing up in elaborate outfits, but she didn't do any of that at the inauguration. She just kind of came as herself and basically just said, I don't care, we're done here. Anybody else have anything to add? All right, should we move on? Question 2. Question 2 is over chapter 6, Grown Woman Theology, and it's Cooper discusses grown woman theology in her book. What is grown woman theology, and how does it inform her understanding of white Republican voters? Basically, what I got out of it is in a conversation with her grandmother, who was talking to her about sex, and the rest of the chapter was kind of over like how I think her upbringing was a Baptist. So she had a really strict like Baptist upbringing that basically told her that, not to practice abstinence, not to have sex before marriage, any of that kind of stuff, like suppress all of her dirty, impure thoughts. And her grandma essentially told her to just throw that all out, that she was like, what's the point in making it and being like a respectable, hardworking member of society who, like, she put herself through school and got a doctorate. Like, essentially what she said is, what's the point of being successful if you're miserable and alone? Mm-hmm. And her grandma, what she took from it was that her grandma's theology for a grown Black woman was basically set on dissent of biblical truths and social mores that were used to shame women, especially Black women, and cast their sexuality as bad and evil and sinful. And essentially she told her that she should kind of interpret it for herself and, to do what makes her happy, and to not let, like, Christian morality kind of control the way that she went about her life. And the part about Republican voters, she said that primarily white male theologians who created this system of evangelical Christianity were trying to make sense of a theology that would fit their own lives and their own worldview. which I agree with. This is why predominantly white Christians read the Bible and vote Republican, because for them, nothing about the Bible essentially challenges fundamental principles of white supremacy or male domination. It kind of goes hand in hand with that. Conservative biblical interpretation became a hallmark of the rise of the religious right. It was a political force with goals of essentially imposing their like strict white moral way of life on everybody else, and they used it as a way to make anybody who didn't adhere to that come off as like immoral and un-American and uncultured. And they use conservative religious Republican factions essentially use this as a way of implementing their dominant kind of worldview culture into government policy. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that's all there is to say about the Republican part. And I think that the way I kind of summed up the grown woman theology stuff was that she was just raised in this very typical church bringing where they're suppressing, your body and making it seem like everything you do is really evil and bad, and really like putting Black women especially down in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that what her grandma told her was basically screw all that and like liberate your body and do what you want and feel free to give yourself pleasure.
Exactly.
She kind of puts it in a more crude way later, but I
There
think
was
that was
another
the gist of
part
it.
of the chapter that I really liked, if I can find it. One way that this is a quote from page 130. One way that I internalized white supremacy in my honors classes, which were 95% white and in which the kids were overwhelmingly Christian, was to associate the success I sought with the kind of whiteness and morality that shaped my classmates' lives. White privilege works by making the advantages white people have invisible while making the supposedly poor choices of people of color hyper-visible. And then on the next page, she says, I was conditioned to believe in the myth of my own exceptionalism. And that one more page over on 132. Wait, no, that's not the right quote.
Yeah, then there's also a part that says white kids are set up to succeed while like the Black kids are set up to fail even in intimacy.
Yeah.
So like back to that oppression of the body, especially with Black women.
Because they have less access to resources and sex education. I think there was a part of it where it was like in schools that teach abstinence only, like teen pregnancy rates are way higher than ones that talk about contraceptive measures and give access to condoms and birth control. I found the other one. So on 139, she says, we believe a lot of other absurd theologies too. Many Black Christian girls are seduced by white evangelicalism because hell, it seems to be working out so well for white people. Which I don't know, that resonated with me when I read it because it fits so well. Do we want to move on to question 3?
Yeah. I can start. According to Peggy McIntosh, white people have an invisible knapsack. Do you agree with her on the components of the knapsack? Yeah, I agree for the most part. Like, she just kind of says that white people are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, the same as males are kind of not taught, or taught to not think of themselves as like, male privilege. I don't know, she says, white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, blah blah blah. You know, describing white privilege makes one newly accountable. I don't know. Here, let me pull it up. It's just I don't know. And then it also just talks a lot about how she comes into like daily contact with things that I don't know how to word this. Like in her workplace, she comes in contact with like a bunch of scenarios that she knows other people, like white people, don't have to deal with. Like one of them is, I can, if I wish to, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I don't know, just
Yeah. When I read that list, it kind of struck me that pretty much all of those are something that I could apply to myself. Like, as somebody who's going into teaching history, number 6, when it says, when I'm told of our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is.
yeah.
You know, as white people, it's spot on. I mean, growing up, we were essentially told that we built the world, that we civilized the whole world.
Yeah, people can kind of take history and make it what they want about things.
And that goes hand in hand with the one with number 7 right under it, where it says, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the experience or to the existence of their race.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because thinking back to, I don't really remember much of elementary school, but like middle school and high school, like I really don't remember, at least in American history classes, I don't remember reading about anything dealing with slavery, and then, you know, the unit that we did on the civil rights.
That's all really we ever learned in my schools. I feel like there wasn't much other like cultural, like, I mean there was to a certain extent, but it was just like so brief in comparison to everything else.
I think the reason I liked the most on the list was 16, which is I can remain oblivious of the language and customs of persons of color who constitute the world's majority without feeling in my culture any penalty for such oblivion or obliviousness.
Yeah, that's.
And I think that's a huge one that happens a lot, especially when you're a part of a dominant group.
I mean, think about when Americans go abroad. Like, we kind of just make fucking fools of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, we basically take it for granted that we speak English and we just assume that everyone else will learn it, and a lot of the world does, but still we take that kind of stuff for granted a lot. And you see that cultural ignorance all the time. I mean, even when the Native American people came to speak to us, they brought up the things about the chiefs and stuff, like all that's this cultural ignorance stuff that happens every single day.
I never thought about that stuff, or even like dressing up as a Native American for Halloween.
Yeah,
it's terrible.
This is kind of a tangent, but when I was in Germany, like one of the, at least in Berlin, like one of the big things they do there is they're really about recycling. And so, and you can drink on the streets. So, you know, anybody will walk down the street drinking soda or beer out of a glass bottle. And then what you do, what's culturally expected is that you leave it somewhere like under a waste bin or somewhere where it's not like in the way or going to get kicked over, so that eventually somebody will come along and collect those for change. Somebody will pick them up. But when we would get new classmates in, because it was like a 3-6 week block program. So I stayed there the whole time, but some people would come in like after the first 6 weeks or after the first 12 weeks, In
Yeah.
every single one group of those new kids, you'd have people who would walk past them and like kick them over, or they'd finish a beer and smash it on the ground, and everybody else would turn around and look at them and just be like, "What the hell? We don't do that here. Like you're making all of us look bad by doing this."
Yeah.
There was also this time that this one girl from my program got. So like when you walk into most bars or nightclubs, like, you know, you got to give your ID to the person, and they always start talking to you in German, and they're going to be polite about it if you ask politely, "Sprechen Sie English, bitte?" Which means, "Do you speak English, please?" It's probably broken, but like the politeness comes across. But this girl was like, "No, I speak English, speak English," and he was like, "Okay, yeah, you can go to the back of the line and leave." And I was just like, wow.
Yeah. One that really like stood out to me, I've never thought about it, is I can choose blemish cover or bandages and flesh color and have them more or less match my skin.
That's another good, because they're just called flesh colored, but it's not skin colored for everybody. It's just us.
Yeah, and she, like, right before she starts listing it all, on the first page at the bottom, she says, whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work which will allow them to be like us.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like this common theme with the entire list, is this
Yeah,
being a part of this dominant group. We see ourselves as the normal ones and not as anything different or foreign or other.
Mm-hmm.
because that's essentially what respectability politics is. It's like telling people of color, like, you'll be more respectable if you act white, if you what's the word, if you assimilate with white culture, then we'll respect you, but if you stick to your own culture, then you're not going to be seen in as good of a light because you're different, and we don't like that. Is essentially what it's saying to people.
Yeah. How much do you know? Can you like tell what time we're at?
15.
We're at 15?
Yeah, I started kind of late too, so I mean, we're probably already at 20.
Isn't it only 10 minutes?
It's 15,
15 to
minimum
20.
15.
Oh.
If I can say one more thing about this article, one other thing that kind of struck me was right after she gets done listing all that stuff off, she says, "I repeatedly forget each of the realizations on this list until I wrote it all down,"
Yeah.
because
I saw
we never think about it.
This was written in 1989, and
Whoa.
I wonder if any of this changes for these days, because I mean, I think there's definitely been a shift towards being more aware with
Yeah,
these kind of things these days.
more aware, but
Like first, I know, like, I mean, I agree with a lot of the lists, but for some of them, I felt like like they were kind of reaching with it a little bit. I know one of them was about the neighbors and like assuming that they'll be nice to you. And I mean, I obviously can't speak from too much experience, but that probably just comes down to like if you think most of the world is good or bad people. And I mean, I think the reality is that most of the people in the world are decent enough to not be rude to your neighbors.
that is true mentality.
And
But
maybe that's something that was different back then since it was in 1989.
yeah, but I guess that's a thing that like we never like, or that's really horrible, that like the dominant group doesn't have to worry about, is like neighbors being pleasant to you because of your race, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, like that would never cross my mind, but that is something that others.
It's essentially saying that we set the standards and just expect everybody else to follow along.
Yeah, exactly.
And like the thing about the entire article is that it doesn't really it like asks a lot of questions and it really doesn't offer anything in the way of answers to me, and I didn't really like that. Like it keeps telling us that we need to
Change.
dismantle this kind of thing and change and like address these sorts of advantages, but then that's it. There isn't the slightest bit of how or what we can do as individuals.
Basically, it just sums it up by saying like systematic changes take decades, and that's you just have to do it.
All it really says is, as we know from watching men, it's an open question whether we will choose to use unearned advantage to weaken hidden systems of advantage, and whether we will use any of our arbitrarily awarded power to try to reconstruct power systems on a broader base. So yeah, it's just saying we need to do something about it, but it's very I can't think of the word.
It's very vague.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like in the last 30 years, how long ago was this written? We do
It
have,
has been 30 years ago since it was written.
but I mean, I feel like there is more solutions now than there probably were back then. So I don't even know what I'm saying.
I don't know about solutions, but awareness.
Yeah.
There's definitely more awareness nowadays.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the case for like a lot of these articles. Is that a lot of them are very, very old, and I would say that in the last 10 years, we've probably made a lot of improvements in a lot of these areas.
Definitely.
So I would be interested in seeing it be updated.
As in 10 years with the articles.
Because I mean, there's even articles about like LGBTQ stuff in here, and
I mean, that stuff.
Obviously that stuff's changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have anything to add, or should we adjourn this meeting?
I'm good.
All right. Guess in that case, I'll see you guys next week.
All right, see ya.